I'll hand over this podium to Ramki sir to initiate the session, and then we can have a discussion by Priyanka. She can speak about her book, and then followed by a discussion by Professor Pasha, and then we'll take question and answers, and that's how we can conclude the session. Thank you, sir. Ramki sir, over to you.
I hope I'm audible.
Yeah.
First of all, I should thank CSPS for initiating this inaugural discussion on Priyanka Chandra's book. Let me congratulate Dr. Priyanka Chandra for this very important achievement. I'm happy to see it being published by a very well-known global publisher, Routledge from London. And I'm also extremely happy to be in this meeting with Professor A.K. Pasha, who has been a friend and a colleague for decades together. I will speak later what I want to, but just to introduce things so that Priyanka can start the discussion on her book, an elaboration on what she has written. This book, Postcoloniality and Statehood, the Case of Egypt, it comes out of certain considerations of the usual problem that we confront in academic circles to connect theory with our subject matter, the data we have, the research we have done. And it's a significant effort here by Dr. Priyanka Chandra to link these two aspects. Discussing postcoloniality, particularly her specific idea of post-colony with respect to the global South in general and with respect to Egypt in particular. What she tries to do is to see it double aspects of postcolonialism that we discuss. One is the postcolonial theory, which talks about hegemonic discourses, colonial discourses, the process of othering, power relationship that you have from the researcher and the viewer, and their own relationship with the subject matter that is being studied. So the aspect of a colonial discourse, a hegemonic discourse that we come through in postcolonial theory, of which we know Orientalism by Edward Said has been the seminal work, and Said talks a whole lot about Egyptian colonial past, how the British and the French approached the Occident, approaching the Orient in general, but approached the West Asian region in particular. And what were the problems with the perspectives of Europe and the Western world in general. Egypt comes as a prominent element in that. In Priyanka Chandra's work, we see that this aspect of a colonial discourse, the question of seeing countries and societies like Egypt from a dominant position, what we have to do is to study countries like Egypt or countries like ours from the vantage points of the struggles that are going on within these countries, from the perspectives of the people who are engaged with it, from an analysis of the uh, institutions that work and the problems that people face and the confrontations between the civil society and the state in these kinds of societies. So a kind of bottom-up approach is required, and that is what is being provided in this book. There are several things that are being discussed in the book. One obviously is a theorization of the state with respect to its institutions, state with respect to the civil society and the social contract, and state with respect to countervailing forces from civil society, how state transforms itself. State is not understood as a static entity. State is an ever-evolving entity. The role of the military is very significant in the case of Egypt. The role of democratic movements like the Arab uprisings that we have seen in 2010-11. Then you have the confrontation between the state on the one hand and religious movements on the other, most of the time, except for a short period after the Egyptian uprising. You have the role of religion and politics as a significant element. As part of the discussion on civil society, various civil society actors, particularly there is a section on women's movement and their implications for the politics of civil society in Egypt and their contributions to the process of democratization to whatever extent that was available in Egypt. So there's a whole lot to discuss. I would first request Dr. Priyanka Chandra to present her book to this audience so that we can gain the fruits of her research, which took quite a long time. So she has substantial things to say. We like to hear that. Over to you, Dr. Priyanka Chandra.
Thank you, sir. Am I audible? Okay. Thank you so much. First of all, thank you to CSPS for organizing this event and for giving space to this book. And thank you to Azima for being here to moderate. I'm very honored to be speaking with my professors, Professor Ramakrishnan and Professor Pasha, on the panel. I agree, Azima, it is very nostalgic. It is like being back at SIS, which is equal parts comforting and daunting. so that's a good thing. No, but they're happy memories. So I'm very thrilled that my first conversation about this is in particular company. And thank you, sir, for giving that outline. I, as sir said, as Professor Ramakrishnan said, there is a lot to discuss. So I have a lot to say, and I almost don't know where to begin. So I would start with what was my interest or my entry point into looking at this this whole subject. Was my first brushes with Western political philosophy and reading about things like classical liberalism, the theory of the state, the social contract. Those are the first things that I was reading, which I found very interesting. How do you conceptualize or imagine state and statehood, and how do we make sense of the state in the current world based on this sort of conceptualization? But the more I in political philosophy, I realized that there are a lot of things, very personal, very organic, very peculiar to us, which somehow have no space in that sort of theorization. Whether it is, the role of religion, whether it is the importance of our kinds of more traditional social and political formations, whether it is other economic formats which somehow don't find much of a space in centric discussions of political economy, even historically, not just in the current world. And if at all there is a mention of what is problematically referred to as the non-West, it is often under the aegis of cultural relativism, which is again extremely problematic because it is again that Orientalist construction of the clash of civilizations thesis and painting certain communities, certain parts of the world in a certain way. And saying that the vexed question of politics, at least today for much of the world, and I would argue that it's no longer limited to the global south. Today, that is also a question for the global north countries, is how does democracy run efficiently? And how is it preserved? And how is it constantly brought about and reasserted and renegotiated? So that's now become a global question. So, tackling this question in this particular theoretical framework seemed to be very problematic because it was very limiting, this whole theorization. And so, of course, Edward Said's Orientalism becomes a starting point, but then there is so much more to delve into, particularly when we think of moving away from this, Western and modern construction of the state and trying to make sense of the state in our context. And so that is why the term post-coloniality comes in, as Sir also said. So there are two aspects to using the term post-coloniality, and I know that right now post-colonialism, or particularly words like decolonization, have also become extremely contentious, with many, many meanings and connotations attached to them. So it is all the more important to clarify what one means and why the term post-coloniality. So it is the two-pronged approach of one looking at the kind of historical evolution of the state in countries like Egypt and most countries of the global south that have been former colonies at some point or the other, and what that history of colonization has done to these particular countries, right? Not just in that period in history, but one of the big questions that post-colonialism must contend with is, um, you know, when we say that at some point they gained independence and there was this moment of decolonization, as it is called, that happened, has it truly happened? Because if a colonial entity or power is not there, but the structures and hierarchies of power remain, and they remain essentially colonial in nature, has that decolonization effectively happened? And that is a question that permeates the political and economic realms of the business of the state. So in that sense, what is the historical legacy of the post-colonial state that it continues to contend with that, and it continues to grapple with today, both politically and economically? And the second is from the theoretical vantage point of post-colonialism itself and what it claims to or seeks to do. Of course, we know post-colonialism has emerged from literary criticism and literature and a lot of literary works, and has thereby become extremely important to political studies as well. And yet, again, there are certain limitations. I feel it's a game of going 3 steps forwards and 2 steps backwards, where, there is a certain questioning of certain ways of understanding power in realpolitik as well. But they are still perhaps somewhere mired in, a very set format of looking at politics at large, which is very rooted in, Western modernity still. So even when we talk about concepts like democratization today, even when we talk about concepts like what authoritarianism means today, how we understand the play of hegemony, and how, we then see what responses to hegemony are, there has been a sort of limitation in how these have been, uh, you know, uh, imagined, and therefore how actual movements on the ground have been read, vis-a-vis this theory. So both these contentions together present some interesting problems, very vast problems. And so this book hopes to make at least a dent in addressing them. And so I would begin by saying that uh, the social contract itself is something that needs to be thought of, not and the state, therefore, as the product of the social contract. Uh, in Western political philosophy, it is supposed to be, at least initially in the works of people like Hobbes, Locke, it is supposed to be something absolute almost. Especially Hobbes's idea of the state is very interesting in that way, and creates a leviathan. But in our context, and now I think also globally, it is important to see it as dynamic and something that needs to keep evolving. This is not just on account of the anxiety that a lot of IR scholars had with the rise of the so-called non-state actor. There was this concern with now what happens with the state. Subsequently, in the last few decades, we've realized that the state is still the most important political entity, in the way that human life is regulated right now. And so with the rise of newer challenges, in fact, the role of the state has become more important, more crucial. And so now it is all the more important that it has to be very dynamic and it has to constantly evolve, right? But what is the vantage point from which this will evolve and grow? So there are, in that sense, there are three aspects to the state that I was looking at when I was looking at Egypt. Why Egypt? Because again, this is a very interesting, it has a very interesting history of being a very old uh, uh, and quite evolved society, with a newer, with that whole experience, and subsequently a newer state system which was somewhat imposed top down from above, right? And that was not just in the time of the British and the French mandates, but even before that, with the coming of Muhammad Ali, who was actually an Albanian officer, a recruit of the Ottoman Empire, who subsequently claimed Egyptian territories and broke away from the Ottoman Empire. But his efforts to modernize and create some sort of a modern state system. At that time, the term state didn't exist, but some sort of a modern political entity was one of the first inroads to creating these structures of power, which were subsequently then taken up also by colonial powers. So modernizing the bureaucracy, modernizing the military system, to some extent, some intervention and interest in land reform and land holding. These were the kinds of things that that particular rule looked at. With the creation of the modern state, some interesting things happened, of course. The first is, the fact that while there was a relatively newer state system or structure of hierarchies that was imposed, older systems did not, and traditional systems did not cease to exist. In fact, they interacted with each other in very interesting ways, producing very peculiar realities. So you had, the local class composition of, let's say, the military suddenly transition into becoming the regime, and becoming the face of political authority post the Free Officers' Revolution. And this was interesting because, again, contrary to very absolutist notions of what is authoritarianism, what is military rule, this was very interesting because it had certain amount of appeal almost, and legitimacy in the eyes of the people at that time in that particular context. Nasser, to this day, is actually celebrated as a national hero, and at one point was a regional hero. And this was in spite of the fact that there were also, considerable problems in Nasser's regime, including repression of dissent, which happened locally, or including the way in which the economy was unable to consolidate or be consolidated. And the fact that the 1967 war had, a particularly damaging effect on an economy which was very slowly trying to build. Yet you also had things like, the nationalization of the Suez Canal and such efforts, which not only made a very important statement internationally, but also solidified the nationalist image of the military and military leaders as a very legitimate force in the society. So that, and that is something that has continued over time with its own kind of internal upheavals, but it has continued in the time of Sadat and even later in the time of Mubarak. So this book, of course, looks at the period from 1972 to 2011, which are the reigns of Anwar Sadat and Hosni Mubarak. And both these leaderships, both the leaders in their personalistic style also present very interesting differences and anomalies, because one, they were a stark departure from Nasser. In the time of Sadat, at least, there was almost this policy of what is called denasserization, which was taken up, because he was very keen to sort of establish himself as a public hero. Mubarak, in contrast, of course, was a lot more conservative, not very open to public scrutiny. And that reflects in the kind of policies, in the kind of openness for media, for political opponents even, that was allowed or not allowed during both periods. What is interesting is that, again, as I was saying, rather than it being a very absolutist authoritarian regime, as has been typically categorized, what you see is there is some sort of push and pull that constantly happens with other social forces. So, for instance, Sadat's reign is interesting because, of course, he brings in the infita or the open door policies, which I'll talk about in a minute. But along with that, there is a shift in Egypt's entire political, foreign policy, economic trajectory of going from being the leader of the Arab world, which is what Nasser's ambition was, and the slogan of Pan-Arabism, to then going to the slogan of Egypt first. So even locally, opening up some space for oppositional forces like the Muslim Brotherhood, the Al-Ikhwan, or having a certain amount of media and free media was something that was a departure in some ways from the previous regime, and also something that then ironically became the bane of Sadat's reign and ultimately led to his assassination post the Egypt-Israel peace treaty. So and then subsequently you have Mubarak, who comes in, who was, as I was saying, was a lot more conservative in his approach. But the point is that every now and then you see that space is opened up for either the media, or there is some space opened up for political opposition or certain parts of political opposition. And simultaneously, you have a growing or increasing consolidation of power, which is also happening. So, whether it is the emergence of a military industrial complex, whether it is the emergence of how more and more investments go into private hands, and excessive bureaucratization means that gains control of a lot of the private economic activity. These shifts also happened, and they mark the emergence of military not just as a distinct political, but a distinct political economic class. And this has been a very distinctive feature of the Egyptian political history, with its own repercussions, in not just, of course, in economy or in politics or in foreign policy, but also in terms of, again, how this authority, or how this hierarchy, or this source of power, or this face of power was perceived by people. So there were, it's interesting that while there would be a lot of questioning, not quite openly, there would be some resistance. There was also this almost daunting appeal at times, and especially in times of strife, particularly around let's say, conflicts and wars. There was a great deal of public faith in these, forces as well, which is very interesting. So the more closely you look at that political space and that interaction between what became the new political elite and the people, the more we realize that it's not something that can be colored in black or white. It's not something that you can see as very absolute, but it's something that has had very interesting sort of loopholes and disjunctures and just one example of that I would give, because there are a lot of systemic and structural changes that were being brought about to create this consolidation of power. You would have, the new permanent constitution of 1971. You would have a lot of amendments to, let's say, the emergency law and other such features of the constitution, which brought more and more power to the center and to the top leadership. At the same time, you had a peculiarly relatively free judiciary, right, which also lends this air of legitimacy to the regime, uh, uh, even though there was a creation of separate military courts and those kinds of things. But it's very contrary to that very absolutist notion that we have of how we read authoritarianism, at least from a Western lens, from a Western prism. Of course, the biggest shift was because of Infita was the economic policies, the open door policies of 1971. And this was why the Egypt First slogan was given. Now, this was most interesting because this is where you see the greatest impact of global forces on this particular trajectory. And I will say here, whether it's in reference to the nature of leadership, whether it is in reference to the economic performance of countries like Egypt, very often, in theorization terms like we I think most recently, wrote about Egypt, citing it as one of those failed states. This is interesting because, and it's something that I think requires an interrogation, because a failed state effectively means a kind of, internally imploding state, a state where there are internal problems structurally and functionally, because of which it basically leads to its own doom in a way. And this is where I would say the Egyptian case is a departure from this definition of the failed state, which is that you see the constant, assault almost of global neoliberalism, which is what has had a very stark impact on the economy and how it interacts with political forces. And that is, you can assess the nature of the Egyptian state or most global South states independent of these global forces. And if you're going to say that, then this categorization perhaps is not the most befitting or adequate. Because what happened in Egypt is that the Infita policies came at a time when the economy was spiraling, particularly post 1967. When the spoils of war that had been promised were not gotten by, and the war itself had impoverished people, and at a time when the economy was still slowly rebuilding. So the cost of the war had been huge. And subsequently, bringing in this Infida policy was something that opened the local economy to global forces and gradually began to align more and more with international economic forces, started seeking aid and then loans. Of course, Egypt has been at one point the second largest recipient of American aid. But apart from that, the kind of loans and assistance that it started getting from international monetary funds, like international financial institutions like the International Monetary Fund, the IRBD, and later the World Bank, is something that has had a very stark impact, not just economically, but also politically and socially. Because, of course, there we have to look at the problem of neoliberalization itself, right? Which even people who were at one point champions of neoliberalization and these, organizational outfits like the IMF, people like Joseph Stiglitz have gone on to become extremely critical and vocal in their criticism of it, where, something like structural adjustment policies have actually, created a huge immediate crisis and a long-term crisis, because first of all, these are loans, so they are not necessarily in the long term, they're not helping fiscal deficits. But what happens in the short term also is the creation of the likes of special economic zones, the suspension of local taxation, labor laws, environmental policies, and so on and so forth. So any kind of state regulation which could protect its own people, its own workers, its own small-scale producers is something that becomes compromised. And the one big condition or the one big impact of structural adjustment and the kind of reforms mandated by structural adjustment programs is the liquidation of the public sector, which has been a huge problem. In the global south, it is not coincidental that a lot of economies tended to be mixed economies with some inclination towards socialism. This was very much on account of the kind of economic realities they faced in that moment of, in that mythical moment of decolonization. But then to go from that to liquidating the public sector and privatizing increasingly without transparency, without sufficient accountability, with the existence of a very small political economic elite, the military industrial nexus, it's something that led to a host of its own kind of problems. And at the same time, you had austerity measures which were imposed, higher taxation, higher inflation, and any kind of subsidization for people at a local level, at the small scale, was something that was being rescinded. And so it was this double hit that the population and the economy took, of one facing the dire economic crisis and then the newer problems created by structural adjustment. And there's of course a whole theoretical debate also, which a part of the book addresses, on how this this push to align increasingly with this global economy, which again has its epicenter somewhere in the West, has been to the detriment of other economies and other countries. There is of course dependency theory addresses this in a huge way in the context of Latin American countries, but again, the gap between theory and praxis is that rather than that being taken cognizance of, this drive has become more and more forceful. And it's something that we see in a lot of countries right now, problematic reform programs being thrust upon local economies, creating newer and bigger problems. It is very interesting that since I started researching this, structural adjustment itself has gone at least 3 rounds of reform. So I think now it's called something else. It's called ESAP. But the whole model of structural adjustment program that was based on John Keynes's idea is something that has been reformed thrice, but fundamentally the problems, the inherent problems, remain and have been compounded, even at the theoretical level, even in how this whole reform program was conceptualized. And one thing that came out in my research, which was very interesting, was that even World Bank documents, even their own reports, they have admitted to how it is by taking a very skewered view of perhaps few macroeconomic factors that you could argue that it has been a partial success, maybe in countries like Mexico. But for the most part, other countries, whether it's Tunisia, whether it's Chile, whether it's multiple countries across Latin America and West Asia, the impact has been actually very, very detrimental. So, and yet somehow it has on which has continued to pervade. And of course, apart from the very concept on, or the economic model on which this is based, the other thing outside and looking at the whole political economic debate is that there is perhaps a disciplinary shortcoming of how one is not able to see or not looking beyond the macroeconomic factors of what you propose as development and what are the positive I was book. It is one thing to talk about GDP and GNP and so on and so forth, or to talk about this, again, this very misleading construction of the per capita income, which in itself is very problematic. But then or you have, again, ideas of the poverty line and who's below poverty line, who's above the poverty line. There are some very skewed definitions of people, and I'm talking even about young professionals and vocational degrees, and who are forced to do multiple jobs because of inflation. Interesting at one point that the markers of economic prosperity were completely misleading. You would have people who may have cars and may have refrigerators and those kinds of things, or were not able to afford consumable products, whether it was fuel, whether it was meat and dairy, whether it was bread, and anyone, based on what their economic position was supposed to be, what their qualifications were, what their job profiles were, was basically living below that particular marker or that particular economic bracket. So there are notions of relative poverty which are not even acknowledged by these macroeconomic terms, economic definitions of development. It is something that is reflected in the almost invisible marginalization of people who were already in dire straits but are constantly being pushed to the peripheries. It reflects in, for instance, spatiality, where you see the shape, you see the face of cities changing, and at once you have a growing number of newer international standard cities that emerge. But and on the other hand, you have the local population which is being pushed outside the periphery of that city. So how that space, the public space, becomes increasingly unfriendly and even hostile to, let's say, the vendor, the squatter, the slum dweller, and how those people in their own land. So these kinds of shifts are things that are not actually documented by these larger macroeconomic figures, and something that needs to be looked into to really understand what was happening on the ground. There was a point at which the coming of imported cars was hailed as a big mark of development in Egypt, in Cairo particularly. But that sort of camouflaged the reality of majority of the population, whether it was working professionals, whether it was the unemployed, whether it was students who were not seeing many promising opportunities for themselves, and of course, whether it was those who are, the people who kind of live under the radar of the state, the slum dwellers, the people who are not actually fully visible in the eyes of the state. But their survival is, and the scope of their survival is constantly shrinking. So all of these realities, and of course, the most important in this way is also how some parts of the population are affected far more than others. So, the plight and the marginalization of women, for instance, becomes extremely acute. Whether it is challenges that they are facing become extremely acute. And this is something we've seen multiple times over. It has been seen, for instance, even in the pandemic, some of the most fantastic work was being done by economists and feminist economists who were looking at the impact of the pandemic on women, particularly, whether it is as part of the workforce, whether it is within the domestic space, and so on, whether it is in public spaces and how much access we have to that. And so the impact of what seems to be very far-flung meta-narrative global policies in a very personal way on women, on their ability to access spaces, on movement. These are all things that are actually not very well documented unless you are to go into personal anecdotal histories, unless you're going to go into digital archives, which are at once personal and global. Before the Arab uprisings, there were a host of online blogs and personal histories being documented, sometimes as blogs, sometimes. So from a theoretical vantage point, are often ignored. They're the unconventional archives that we need to look at more and more in order to get a fuller picture of what was happening. So, you know, these were the kind of changes that are happening at the level of the state, at the level of politics and economy. But of course, the argument of the book is that they have to be interrogated from the prism of the social movements and social transformations. And what do I mean by that? When I say social transformations, the reason I'm using this broader term is because it encompasses multiple things, right? And it was particularly when I was looking at social movements in Egypt and in other places in the global south that it becomes increasingly apparent that even the way in which opposition or dissent or resistance has been read has, even colonial limitations to how it is understood. For instance, the very notion of democratization is considered to be something, and there's a democratization theory which talks about it as a very linear sort of process, right? Of a set of institutions and structures which will be implemented, and therefore there'll be a certain kind of political culture, and that is what will then go on to sustain democratic processes. Theory. But what you see in the case of Egypt and many other such countries is that with their own peculiar realities, they are constantly thwarting this particular construction of what democratic processes look like, or even what hegemony and counter-hegemony look like. There are already lots of people, whether it's Asif Bayat talking about non-movements, whether it is Nancy Fraser talking about the public sphere in newer ways, going far beyond, what the public sphere in a very restrictive way. There is already a criticism of how there has to be a broader view, which is a lot more encompassing of very different variables, factors, influences, forces who are a part of these social movements and the public sphere. And so that is what I was looking at. There's one entire longish chapter dedicated to social transformations, which I call consonant notes, dissonant notes. And the reason is that there are a host of variables, very disparate sometimes, sometimes even contrary in the way that they're thinking or acting or what their aspirations are, but which present a very interesting plethora of the kind of social political activism that has been present in the society for a very long time, and which is why I say that it's a very old society with a newer state imposed top down. So there are ways about civil society, and I take a very broad view of what the civil society is, not the liberal construction of or what the Marxist criticism of the civil society was, but a larger imagination of the civil society, with both the organized and the unorganized and the undisciplined parts of social movements, even the non-movements, as things that are constantly in a dialogue with the state and constantly seeking to renegotiate that social contract that we talked about. So in the case of Egypt, there is, of course, a discursive and theoretical sort of division between secular and religious imaginations of civil society. Again, to the popular view, these are not necessarily always completely divergent. Sometimes they've taken a very oppositional view to each other. For instance, if you were to look at people like, Farag Fauda or Sadiq Jalal al-Azam on one hand, and then look at people like, Maududi, or Rashid Rida on the other, of about these things. In practice, the kinds of variables, actors, ideologies that have been active have encompassed both sides and more within that. So for instance, there is, of course, the Muslim Brotherhood, which has had a very interesting history in Egypt, right? Its roots are in anti-colonialism, largely as a social movement, and then it goes on to be banned and has existed largely as an underground organization for most of its existence. Somehow it still has, for the large part, if in the early decades, it still had a certain credibility with the population because it was focus on social welfare activities. And gradually, how it began to, in a very strategic way, also permeate politics with, in the 80s and 90s, you had members of the Brotherhood contesting municipal elections and so on and so forth. But largely, their ability to step in where effectively people felt that the state needed to be active and wasn't, in providing help with housing, with healthcare, with education. And these were the things that gave them a certain credibility at that time. This is why there was a section of the Egyptian population which saw them as a viable political leadership in the aftermath of the Arab uprisings as well. But then, of course, to say that there's only one religious ideology out there is also very misleading. You also had, outfits like Jamal Islamia and the Jihad group, which were responsible for the assassination of Sadat, and had a more extremist sort of stance on various issues. You have, very interestingly, the role of Al-Azhar, which is, again, a very, very interesting, exceptional case. One of the oldest religious institutions and institutions of religious learning. Again, from the outside, it's very often seen to be almost hand in glove with the leadership. But to say the least, it has been an uneasy alliance. The Al-Azhar has, on occasion, asked for the public to abide by what is being done and to keep law and order and so on and so forth. But at the same time, it has also been a bit reticent in giving all-out support to military regimes. So, a host of films, novels, more than sometimes academic works or more than political commentaries sometimes demonstrate this slight tension which has always existed between the two. And the students movement, which has been very, very important, the students and professionals who also led the Kifaya movement. You have of course, women's movements, which have had multiple voices and multiple kinds of imaginations. It intersects with both the question of religion and secularism, but also with what citizenship means for women, particularly, whether it is in the economic context, whether it is in the context of their political liberties, whether it is in the context of their economic standing and economic rights, and so on. So this host of things and host of sort of ideas that have created an interesting mesh is something that makes for a very vibrant political culture, which is often dismissed as being too untenable, again, in Western approaches, but is something that creates some interesting anomalies. One, it poses this question of whether democratization is in fact a linear process, right? And this is also the biggest contention. It is interesting to see that there are some of the most vibrant or most, vocal, most visibly present, in street politics, resistance movements where you have the greatest degrees of authoritarianism. And that is something that is unmatched even by the so-called democratic countries and democratic spaces in the West. So that thwarts that whole linear imagination of democratization. It also creates interesting tensions in the notions of hegemony and counter-hegemony. What creates hegemony? What creates counter-hegemony? Of course, to the extent that the organized civil society space was somewhat controlled by the state, it also becomes this medium of cultural hegemony and hegemony of the state. But the same things, and of course, we saw this in the most obvious way in the Arab uprisings, the same space can also become that space of counter-hegemony, of resistance, of questioning the government or questioning the regime, questioning the state itself. And of course, one of the most important things is how, what is the impact of these social transformations? And I'll stop with this point. I know I've been going on for some time. So what is the impact of these social transformations? They lead us to what is usually treated as this question of legitimacy. You know, when you have a movement in the street, and or you have a resistance, or you have a questioning or a call to rethink political organization or the terms of the social contract, actually what you see is that it still sees the state as a legitimate entity, right? And so that is again very interesting and very contrary to an absolute way of looking at these states as failed states or weak states or whatever those categorizations are. It is very contrary to that. So in the context of Egypt also, you see that these social transformations have happened, these movements have gone on. Very often they've been thwarted also. There's been repression as well. Uh, it has constantly upheld certain aspects of statehood and of that being party to that social contract and that citizenship. And perhaps even with its disjunctures, there's been a greater dialogue or a greater deliberation on what this citizenship should constantly be evolving into in the case of Egypt. Of course, the most pertinent thing is to for the world to be and particularly for organized global forces, economic forces, political forces, to be aware of and to be able to read these social transformations. So, rather than having top-down policies, not just from the state, but from global political and economic forces, whether it's economic, it's political processes and so on, rather than having that sort of top-down approach, disciplining a certain kind of and imposing forcefully a certain kind of homogeneity, which can be extremely dangerous. Thinking about, not just the economy, but economy, politics, social transformations at large, and what they can look like and how they can inform global structures. I don't know if this is, a very optimistic view of what can be done or what can be an approach that informs our thinking. But as a criticism or as a critical questioning, it's something that remains very pertinent as you keep seeing in the movements and non-movements that emerge from Egypt and other countries in West Asia. I'll stop here and over to Professor Ramakrishnan.
Thank you, Dr. Priyanka Chandra, for that insightful exposition of your book. Several questions are raised and addressed in the book. The question of democracy, for example, the paradox between almost permanent authoritarianism, except certain short-term vacations from that, but a very active civil society at the same time. The question of neoliberal transformations and the effect of that on Egyptian, ordinary Egyptian people. The issue of military, again, military seen not only as an authoritarian force, but also at certain junctures in the Egyptian history, particularly Nasser's era, etc., how military itself is seen as a popular kind of alternatives to other kinds of political institutions. So popular military, something that's an interesting thing. So what all these, contribute to as our own understanding of democracy as a process with all those very different processes. The most important being your inquiry into civil society movements of various kinds and what they actually contributed towards the transformation of the Egyptian state at different junctures. But still, the reality as we see today is the military is in a very strong position. The suppression of popular movements happen at every moment. But what we can gather from Priyanka Chandra's presentation and from her book is that, there still is a contestation. that it's not a settled matter altogether. And I hope Professor A.K. Pasha will tell us more about the book, his own take on the book. Extremely happy to invite Professor Pasha to discuss the subject matter of the book. To you.
Thank you, Professor Ramakrishnan, for inviting for this interesting book discussion. I think after a long time, we have a study on Egypt. Earlier, before the oil boom and petrodollars, the focus of most research books globally and also in India was mainly on Egypt and the old states like Iraq or Iran or Sudan, etc. But I'm happy Priyanka has made an interesting study on Egypt from her perspective, post-colonial state and the political economy and the social movements, transformation, so on and so forth. I don't want to go into the theoretical part she has highlighted in detail. But there are certain things I'm told I have about 10 to 12 minutes to speak. I'll just flag some important points, regarding this discussion on Egypt and the book. As I said, at the outset, it's an important contribution to study an aspect of contemporary Egypt, particularly the Sadat and Mubarak period between 70 and 2011, which is a continuation of the earlier Nasir era, when the free officers overthrew the monarchy in July 1952. Since then, with brief civilian rule, the military continues to dominate the political system. There's no doubt about it, and I have no doubt that it will continue to dominate in the foreseeable future, despite the civil society movement calls for democratization or the Arab Spring or suppression of dissent, so on and so forth. Let me briefly make a few points. You see, the ancient Egypt, the historical Egypt, was a major superpower in the region. It not only established the Egyptian state structure, which he talked about, mainly to distribute the Nile water and trade and other aspects, but it colonized what is present-day Sudan and Levant, parts of Yemen and Libya, so on and so forth. It was a huge state, and now we are talking about post-colonial state. So Egypt has been an independent entity, independent state with its own structure And, throughout the recorded history of Egypt, one goes back to the pharaonic period, so on and so forth. They had one of the best administrative system, the achievements par excellence. And it was known for much of the world, along with the Mesopotamian civilization and the other civilizations which flourished in this region. What I'm trying to say here is geography, its location in the crossroads of Asia, Africa, and Europe has shaped its state structures. How the state structures view its citizens, how they grant prosperity or repression or any other aspects which you take, how culture is allowed to flourish at times, how it is suppressed, how religion is allowed at some times, how it is suppressed. So the geography has played a crucial role how the state structures have evolved, shaped, sustained, and how they respond to the people. Because of the desert nature, the Sahara Desert, Sahel, and the limited area of cultivation or inhabitation, hardly 2 to 3% along the banks of the Nile. This has been a constant feature of all states which have emerged, empires ruled in Egypt. The colonial period, of course, I don't want to go into the Islamic period, it's all well recorded. So the colonial period expanded its resources by opening the Suez Canal. It brought Egypt not only new resources, but also control over its economy, its people, its how it shaped its society, culture, even religion to a certain extent. So the colonial impact since Napoleon invaded in 1799 has been a constant, whether Muhammad Ali sending people to Egypt for military training or studies, education, etc. So the outside world has been shaping and reshaping Egyptian state since then, with brief intervals of assertion by local issues. So, and this colonial impact, I think, has shaped how people have adapted to the rulers, whether it is during Nasir period, who were told that they are more Arab than the Egyptians, or during the Sadat period, who were told that they are more Egyptian than Arab, or a mixture during Mubarak period, neither here nor there, lost. So in that way, you have a constant factor in Egyptian society state, and that is religion. Since Amr ibn al-As invaded in the 7th century Egypt during the Khalifa movement, Khalifas, you see, Egypt has been Arabized over a period of time. And religion has played an important role, although Coptic Christians hold on to their language, their culture, their religion, their practices. Orthodox Christians, one of the oldest minorities there. But, they are also Arabized. Their names are not different from the Muslim names or the way they greet. Intermarriages are common throughout the Nile Delta and Upper Egypt. So they have been culturalized. But they hold on to Christianity and they practice, and there is virtually peaceful interaction between the two. But it was the British who used religion through the Muslim Brotherhood, although it took a colonial form and the Palestine movement, anti-Jewish or anti-Zionist features. But out of this, we had structures which still are quite strong, durable, and unshakable virtually. And those are authoritarian structures. Whether it is during the pharaohs who decided what is the quantum of water each village would get, it is the same kind of statement I hear. I've lived in Egypt for 4 years, first in 1985 for my PhD work at the Faculty of Economics and Political Science, and then as a diplomat between 1999 and 2002. I noticed throughout Egypt, I've traveled length and breadth many times, that the reverence and the fear and the respect, whatever you might call for the president or the ruler, is ultimate. Rais is all in all. It is he who would decide whether people can live or they can be hanged, or whether they can sign the peace treaty or go to war. It is one man, and it permeates to the local governor, to the local police officer. It is he who would decide who can be arrested, who can be detained, so on and so forth. So in that way, the authoritarian state remains durable. UB has talked about this in great detail. There is no doubt about it. This is one factor. So the second one is the military. Nasser, Sadat, Egypt, all these people knew that in order to remain in power, they have to show tendencies of liberalism or democracy or some involvement of the people, popular mandate. So the legitimacy question haunted all, including the present military leader, who continues the authoritarian structures built by Nasser, Sadat, and Mubarak, etc. So religion, some try to use, like Sadat or Nasser, the secular approach, so on and so forth. So these social movements, social transformation, religion is also an important factor when you consider the military, its legitimacy, and how they claim to be the guardians of not only national security but also providers of resources to the people. So when I refer to lack of resources, present day Egypt gets its resources from the Suez Canal, from the oil and gas exports, the Egyptians who send remittances from abroad, particularly Gulf, and some trade and export, etc. So managing or feeding the population is a major task, like it was earlier. So appropriation of resources and distribution of resources is a major issue. This is what drove Nasser to work for Pan-Arabism. He thought that Arabs, the oil-rich Gulf Arabs, have resources, and he saw that as Arab resources, not individual resources. He thought that it should be shared among all the Arabs, especially the non-oil producing Arabs like Egypt or Sudan or Morocco or etc. So that is how he worked for Arab unity. He tried to unite through Iraq, through Syria, all this raised eyebrows, or through his intervention in Yemen in 1962, sending military forces, so on and so forth. But his project of Pan-Arabism collapsed, even though he was a towering personality. He was admired, respected, and also feared in much of the Arab world, from Morocco to Iraq. He remained a popular leader despite Saudis using Islam or other countries in the region using Islam. That apart, the collapse, of course, she talked about in 1967. That's been a turning point, not only for the end of Arabism or dream of Pan-Arabism, but also demand for Egyptian nationalism, that Egypt should concentrate on its own business, not get involved in Palestine or Pan-Arab ventures, etc. So 1973 was a turning point where Sadat reoriented his foreign policy away from the Soviet Union to the United States, because he believed that through the United States he can get the territory back, that is Sinai, from Israel, which was occupied in 67, and also the economic aid which Egypt needed, because Soviet Union he had written off virtually in July 1972 during the Ali Sabri coup. So 1973 is an important turning point, and Sadat, who had initiated the Infita before 73, accelerated this process and sought and got US aid, which still continues, which has converted Egypt into a virtual client state, because Egypt is used, or the United States uses the foreign economic military aid to Egypt to see to it that it behaves in a peaceful way with Israel, that it follows Israeli diktats on Palestine issue, whether there's a genocide going on or worst going on in what Israel does in the region. So in that way, I see Egypt through the Infita. For example, Rockefeller, when he visited Egypt, he told Sadat, why do you have to produce wheat? Because Egypt was self-sufficient until the Infita. And he said, you should grow fruits, vegetables, flowers for export, and you will get foreign exchange. So much of the land which used to produce wheat was virtually converted into growing fruits, vegetables, and flowers. And a new class emerged under the Infita, which started consuming these products. So there was nothing left for export, and Egypt became dependent on the United States. So if there is delay of any wheat ship coming from America, the bakeries in Egypt will run out, and there will be food riots like they happened in 77. People will ask, where is my breakfast? That is what Sadat was saddled in 73, and which forced him to go for Camp David and his visit to Israel, so on and so forth. So for this to remain a recipient of aid, you have to control dissent. So that is how the military dominates not only the political structures, but also much of the economy now. Almost 50% of the Egyptian economy is now directly or indirectly controlled by the military, which satisfies first its needs, and then whatever remains is given to the civilians. And if there is any protest movement, it is ruthlessly crushed. So forget about civil society and dissent and opposition or dialogue. These are all state controlled, state manipulated. Whenever they want, for some time they allow, but it is now subject to external powers, whether it is the United States or Israel or even Saudi Arabia or even small states like Gulf. They dictate terms because it has become virtually dependent for money, for economic assistance. So this is a conflict. This is a constant. Conflicting pulls and pressures. On the one hand, the Egyptians want democracy. They want an end to corruption, military rule. They want, all the aspects of a modern liberal state. But because of its peculiar situation of limited resources, the rulers have to take power in their hands, and manage in the way they have been managing for the last 75, nearly 75 years. So in that way, there is this constant struggle between the people who have not given up, whether it is during Nasir period or during Sadat. You can see the uprising, you can see the opposition. Some elections took place during Sadat period. Muslim Brotherhood directly or indirectly contested, and they were there in the parliament. I've seen them, been to the parliament, and I've seen the debate, discussion. You can, the Egyptians have a very high level of political culture. Even though the poverty rate is very high among all the Arab countries, but the level of education, literacy, political awareness, and their understanding of regional, global issues is so sharp, which comes out through their jokes or comedy sessions. It shows their awareness. Whether creating popular jokes against their own rulers, whether it was Mubarak or even now Sisi. It is very common that this perpetual struggle between the people, the civil society and religious groups also, in a way, how they circumvent the political repression, which is widespread, and the republic of fear which the military has created. Because of this fear, much of the intellectuals, they have fled Egypt. You can find the finest Egyptian scholars in the West, in the Arab world, poets, writers, singers, so on and so forth. So the intellectual elite who should have contributed much to the development of Egypt, they are outside, and they are in a very frustrated situation because they fear coming back to live in a ghetto, political ghetto, and or get arrested in the name of putting restrictions on the authoritarian structures or the rulers, the military rulers who have appropriated all power to their satisfaction virtually. I think I'll stop here. I don't want to speak much. And once again, thank both Priyanka and Ramakrishnan for giving me this chance to say a few words. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Pasha. Now, this is the opportunity for the participants to raise their questions, and opportunity for Priyanka to respond. Asima, Dr. Asima Salim will do the coordination of the next part of the program.
Thank you so much, sir. I must say this was a very insightful discussion that we had. And before going to the question and answer session, I just have a few words to say. Firstly, congratulations, Dr. Priyanka, for such a amazing work and such an insightful, work that you have produced. And I feel like I completely agree with Professor Pasha that someone has, worked on Egypt after so long, and the kind of work that you have done, especially theoretically denting which was needed, is much appreciated. Very heartiest congratulations on this book, and I wish everyone, all the participants, should go and read this book and get a lot of insight. I feel this book was more of a thought-provoking, and it was somehow challenging the notions that we have developed over the period of time and how it become very relevant in the today's context as well. Looking at the post-colonialism, somehow when you were speaking about and you were trying to locate this understanding and theorizing, my understanding and my notion was reflecting towards other nations like Libya and all, and trying to see, yeah, this is somehow the notion is somehow relatable and can be explored in that aspect. So I find your talk very inspiring,
And as a senior, like Priyanka was my senior, so I feel as a senior, I felt very inspired by you and motivated to continue working on the subjects that I want to work upon. So congratulations once again, and thank you so much for Professor Ramakrishna and Professor Pasha to providing their comments and insights. Before that, we have two questions. I request all the participants, if they have any queries, suggestions, questions, comments, please mention that on the chat box. There is two question by Naeem. He's asking that what's your say on the radical shift or LCC from a pro-Islamic military stand to an authoritarian and a mild democratic stand? And how does it affect the statehood of Egypt? And also, do you think still there is a hidden public outrage against him as he somehow betrayed the brotherhood? And he has another suggestion. He requires a suggestion that he says, is it feasible to do a PhD study on a Napoleon campaign of Egypt from a post-colonialism theory? Very interesting questions though. So I'll hand over it to Priyanka to respond to this question. In the meantime, if there are any more questions, that are mostly welcomed. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Azima. You're very kind with your compliments. So thank you. Yes, I mean, first of all, a study of the Napoleon experiment in Egypt has to be studied from a post-colonialism prism. There's no other way to study it, I think. And if I can link it to, also, before I go into it, thank you so much, Professor Pasha, because some of the things that you said, they supplement and some of the things that maybe I didn't discuss sufficiently, you've mentioned. But as you said, in looking at legitimacy or questions of how the military has operated, if I can link these two, the first thing is, it's very interesting. Napoleon was actually the first person in his very first public address in Cairo, on the banks of Nile. He was the first person whose documented statement is there, which refers to the Egyptian people, his audience, the Cairene, as the Arab and Islamic civilization. So, bringing that religious identity into a political context, a political connotation, this was something that was very interesting. It was perhaps the first time that it was being done in this way, and it was being done by a colonial voice. So I would actually be very interested to read more on the Napoleon era and presence in Egypt from a post-colonial lens. But that brings me to the question of religion and what's happened, post the revolution. As I was saying, it's never been a very easy alliance in Egypt between the military and the religious forces, so to speak, because on one hand, the military has needed some sort of, religious base. So there has been, this upholding of the Sharia, at least in principle, and time and again, some limited support from the Al-Azhar that I was mentioning, which has been there. Yet the military also has always presented itself as a very modernizing sort of, and modernizing means essentially secularizing political force, right? That's also because their format of political authority was not like that of, let's say, a Saudi political leadership, which espoused a particular brand of religious politics. This was very distinct. So it is I don't think I would categorize it as Islamist rule versus what happens post Arabs. I don't think it's, as I was saying, it's a little messier than that. So those neat and tidy compartmentalizations are not actually possible. There was also a state-led program for with very obvious secular and secularizing overtones, whether it was something called state-sponsored feminism and feminist programs, which are also mentioned in the book, which actually Hosni Mubarak's wife at one point was the face of that, So those kinds of programs, also had a very distinctly secular identity and connotation to them. What has happened post the Arab uprisings is very interesting because you have to read it in conjunction with on one hand, the international and regional sort of interference in Egyptian politics. And what Professor Pasha is saying is absolutely true. By and large, the problem of democratization, if there is a problem of democratization in the region, has been more of external influences and intervention as opposed to a lack of internal political culture. Egypt has a very high political culture, but it is external factors. And so that is something that continued post the Arab uprisings in a very obvious manner. And the other thing that has happened, and this is also common to some other countries, like, you see it in Morocco, you see it partly in Tunisia, where there's also a disjuncture within the religious voices, which to begin with were never homogeneous. There were very different kinds of religious voices which were there. But today, the emergence of the Salafia in Egypt around this time, which is a relatively new thing. It was not there earlier. Very interesting, and how somehow their rise has discredited to some degree the Ikhwan is also very interesting post 2012. So that is something that's interesting to study. Going back to, so I hope that answers your question. I think it's not so much a betrayal of the brotherhood. I don't think the leadership ever espoused any loyalty to the brotherhood whatsoever historically. But current forces, current developments are a result of both these, local, but more so the regional forces which are at play. In the long term, though, one of the most important things is, whatever kind of rule there may be, the most important catalyst is always the economic catalyst. That is ultimately what led to the Arab uprisings also in the region. That is also what has led to dissent, even when there has been a certain looking up to, the political leadership of the country, because and not just because because of any form of hero worship, but also because of the newer overtones of a neo-patriarchal and nationalistic sort of regime, which is what the military has always presented to the people. But it's interesting, and I mentioned it, even when there is not much open criticism, the one thing that will be mentioned, because it is a very urgent personal kind of crisis, is when inflation hits, when there is the rise in unemployment, when things like housing become a problem. There have been protests since 2012 also on these very specific issues. One big issue, and this is common to a lot of post-colonial countries that have been recipients of the or that have had to implement the structural adjustment programs, are the bread riots, which have happened in Egypt also time and again, and they've happened in other places also. And in fact, in Latin America, in places like Mexico, they were called the structural adjustment protests. So, the legitimacy of economic deliverance is very important to any regime in the region. But that is also the where even a very strong or overtly authoritarian regime cannot take that many cannot completely ignore this reality or the dire circumstances, because that is what has led to those immediate kind of outbursts in the street and demonstrations and so on.
Yeah, sorry. Thank you so much. There are a few more questions and good comments. So one, Sachin is asking the role of Egypt in current Islamic world. And Rajendra is congratulating Priyanka Chandra for her work on Egypt and producing a very good book. Both author and Priyanka and Pasha sir has reiterated that the state is a powerful institution and it is a state that determines how civil society will function. They also stated that Egypt does have a strong civil society. Given this, do they see a real progress of democratization taking place in future? Or do they believe Egypt will remain under an authoritarian military regime? So this is the question. Would you like to answer, or should I read out the questions and then you can answer it in right?
I can answer in one go, I think.
Okay, yeah, great.
No, I said I can answer in one go after you've read out.
Okay. So Hussein is also congratulating you for the amazing presentation and how Dr. Chandra emphasized the dynamism of Egyptian state, while Professor Pasha's take is more towards seeing the state from a hegemonic military lens. If I'm correct, how can these two opinions can be reconciled? Nasir is also conveying the congratulations to Dr. Chandra, and I have no question, just a curiosity. If you can tell something about your sources primary to write this wonderful book as discussed by both the professors. And it would be naive to ask, I don't think so, but still, I am asking if you can provide us the PDF of, oh, okay. If you can provide the PDF of this valuable piece. I think this is the most difficult thing to ask from an author, but okay. And I would like to, add one more question. I just, like the last time you were talking about the cover page of your book. So if you can share the the story behind the cover page of your book, that would be great for our audience as well.
Thank you so much. Thank you to everyone for their comments and their wishes. I think maybe I should have started by showing the cover of the book, which is this. This is what it is.
Yeah, it's and as well. So everyone has, yeah.
Yeah, it's on the poster as well. So I'm happy to say that I was able to go there and click this picture. So perhaps it's the thing in the book that I'm most attached to, not because I have taken the picture, but because it's a beautiful place. This is the Mosque of Ibn Tulun. Today, it is actually not one of the most, it's not one of the busiest mosques, but it is the third oldest mosque, I think, in the history of Islam. And so it's beautiful. It has remained more or less, in its original glory. So it's beautiful to visit. And interestingly, this was also created by somebody called Ibn Tulun, who was, a part of the Abbasid Empire, overlooking the Egyptian governorate. So in a way, it's also very telling of, as Professor Pasha said, of how Egypt's history, particularly with reference to the leadership, has often been written by people who have come from the outside or around Egypt. So yes, and on its own, of course, it's a beautiful, beautiful edifice. So yes, I'm also waiting for the PDF actually. So in the meantime, if anyone is able to get their hands on a copy, please do. And I would request you to please hopefully get your libraries to get a copy so that you can see it and see this image also. And hopefully I'll also have something to share soon. To the questions, I would just say that so two questions. I think one was about sources. So this was an interesting thing in my research because I looked at the usual suspects, but then I realized because of the kind of lens I was taking, I had to, go into very a wide variety of things. So you can take your pick of which ones you will qualify as the primary sources, or you can look at the long bibliography which is there. But it includes, from policy papers, from the state government's papers, to the Constitution and other official documents. Whether it's the October Working Paper, the Infita papers, and so on, to then the international organizations and their reports. Those of the World Bank, the IMF, before that the IRBD, yes, and various such organizations. And then I was also looking at a lot of sources which are doing a lot of the critical or groundwork. So let's say the Ibn Khaldun Center, which I think right now is pretty much dismantled, and the works of a lot of people who are not there anymore, at least in Egypt. To even the unconventional sources of digital archives, of anecdotal histories, of popular literature. So in the books, as Professor Pasha also mentioned, I have touched upon things like the value of political jokes, of literature, of works of whether it's leading literary figures like Najib Mahfouz and Nawal al-Sadwi, or it's the smaller or the lesser known kind of writings and works which are there. both in physical format and later subsequently post the 1990s in the online format. So in a way, all of these became important sources. I also was fortunate to travel in Egypt, and the anecdotal histories and the stories of people, while that's not the primary focus of what my research was, but it really helped me flesh out, what has been the experience of something small, like, what inflation means, what it means when you're faced with the question of what kind of school, public school or private school, you have to send your children to. So, those conversations helped a lot really understand the on-ground implications of policy decisions and meta level politics and economics that we usually get a bit lost in. So that was the range of source, and of course there are lots of secondary sources which are already there. There was an interesting gap because, as Professor Pasha mentioned, earlier there were a lot of studies pre 1970s, pre the oil boom. There were a lot of studies on Egypt, but subsequently there was an interesting gap, in the years following. So some of my secondary sources also are very old. But then I've had to go and collect a lot of primary sources, read a lot of economic data, which was a learning curve for me, and look at some of the very contemporary work on this particular area. And to the other question, I think Dr. Rajendra asked a question also. I'm trying to find it, sorry.
So, yeah, basically he asked that how
this is the real progress of democratization. Okay.
yeah.
So the very argument of my book would be that there is, no one particular format of or one particular way of thinking about the progress of democratization. This is also something that I've said often about the Arab uprisings. Again, if you look at media reports and media coverage of the Arab uprisings, particularly in the West, it is very telling of that Orientalist lens and that slightly dismissive clash of civilizations view. But it is also very telling of how there has been a certain rigidity in thinking about democratization itself, where all the questions, all the speculation, all the analysis was in the short term was focused on regime change and whether this revolution is a success or a failure. But I would argue, and that is what the book, it makes this point, that democratization itself has to be seen as something that is more disparate, more dynamic, and with set of in the short term, but in the longer term, what is happening, and also how do you then in that context define it? There are people who are right now writing articles from the United States being very critical of the state of American democracy. But the structures of democracy are very much in place there, right? So, but there still seems to be some sort of anxiety about what's happening. So, yes, I mean, there is a process of democratization that is happening. That is, what this work also says, that interestingly, this kind of flux is more visible where there are authoritarian regimes or tendencies. So yes, that is there. I would not be the one to try to foresee the future and say this specific thing is going to be the outcome. We don't know that, but at the same time, that should not be a reason to dismiss all that is happening and has been happening for many decades on the ground. So I'll leave with that, and you will have to,
Yeah, there's one more question by Hussein, I guess, that Dr. Chandra has emphasized the dynamism of Egyptian state, and while Professor Pasha is taking more towards seeing the state from a hegemonic military lens. So how these two opinions can be reconciled?
No, I think they're not contrary at all. That is why I was saying that many societies do present a very peculiar reality, and this is one of them. As I just said, in some of the most closed spaces is where you see very interesting kinds of activism emerge. That is what we have seen even in the recent history of the region. So yes, and maybe I'm being very optimistic, but I do think that that scope for counter hegemony is created precisely by the nature of hegemonic rules, structures, systems which are there, and which is why you see a very high degree of political culture and more ingenious ways of resisting and questioning and countering hegemony, which emerge from these places, which are quite imaginative. So yes, I don't think they are contrary within themselves. I think they're contrary to a very specific view of what hegemony or authority looks like.
So we'll take the last question of the session and then we can move forward. Hafiz has given a comment as well as a question that I want to sincerely congratulate you on your book, Dr. Priyanka Chandra. Without a question, your work is priceless addition to the area and I'm eager to learn more about it. Regarding today's conversation, it has been quite insightful. I would like to know how you think Egypt's post-colonial history will affect its future influence on Middle Eastern or Pan-African political movements?
So that's a very good question. I would speak less in terms of political influence because that also has certain hegemonic overtones. But one of the things that the book does address is and of course there's not enough time to go into everything in detail, but I'll mention it here, is when we say renegotiating the social contract, reimagining citizenship. Now citizenship today also has these sort of transnational overtones. For instance, I mean, when you talk about the Arab uprisings, that was a transnational movement, right? And the way it broke out was very interesting. Interestingly, economic analysts have talked about how Tunisia, where the movement originated, and then it spread first to Egypt and then to other countries. Tunisia was actually relatively better in its economic standing than Egypt and some of the other countries where the movement then unfolded. But it's the fact of being now exposed to global cultures and realities from different parts of the world. So like I keep saying, sometimes hegemonic systems also produce their own nemesis. Today, because of the online world, digital activism, just the kind of exposure that one is getting, the way that we are thinking about authority or we are talking about political and civil liberties, all of that has expanded considerably for the individual, because you're not just now navigating your immediate reality, but you're also exposed to what's happening in a very different part of the world and how that is informing or influencing or shaping your ideas. So in that sense, I mean, this is something which is very important. And I would say that it's also not one singular aspect. The African political movements have been very rich and very diverse and very vibrant and very imaginative again in how they have constantly been pushing for this sort of post-colonial rethinking of politics, especially in the contemporary political economics context. So yes, I think in that sense, this is very relevant. It is relevant to questions of citizenship or economy, questions of religion, questions of Arabness, which is common to the North African states, and how you're making sense of your identity vis-a-vis the state constantly, as an ongoing dynamic process. So I think it's quite relevant in that way.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Priyanka. I would request Dr. Umair Anas to, speak about the book take 2 minutes, and if you can share a few words about it, that would be great. I think we lost Professor Pasha. I don't know if he's still there or not.
He is.
Hey, I'm here.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I just joined you late. But first of all, congratulations, Dr. Priyanka. I haven't yet seen the book, but I must say that it must be amazing and it must have a lot of great discussions on Egypt. And I will completely agree with Azima that your work has been inspiring many young scholars and, of course, senior scholars as well, without a doubt. Your discussion about the post-Arab uprising Egypt, I would say I kind of agree with you that the regime is still under enormous pressure, because they know that they are still vulnerable to public perception, protest, and whatever happening in Gaza. And that is why the Egyptian role in Gaza crisis has been extremely different from what was supposed to be. It was not compromising. It went completely against Israel, and they made huge bargain on Gaza crisis. Israel is kind of on a setback on this ceasefire, because the Gaza crisis has the way Egypt has brought a new mechanism. I see Egyptian response to this Gaza crisis directly to its domestic politics, because they thought that there could be a huge backlash after if they do not deliver a promising ceasefire. So in this way, this stage of Sisi regime is a kind of a softened authoritarianism. He's reaching out to Islamists. He's speaking to many, and maybe this month we were supposed to see Abul Fattah, the activist, freed from jail. They have already announced it. So maybe he may come out anytime in few weeks or months. So congratulations for your book, and looking forward to reading it, and also reading from you on other aspects of West Asian studies. Because my professors are also there, so sometimes I feel that as if the real West Asian studies is dying in India. The curiosity to access primary interest, and the Indian states and university systems inability or reluctance to send their scholars on field work. I mean, look at the type of PhDs we are producing in our country. I'm not going to say it's substandard, but I would say that without much field work, without knowing the region very well. And when I see books like you have brought out, it gives me immense hope that still we are not that bad, and we are working very well. Our young scholars are really bringing out good works, and they are working very hard despite all the odds, despite the lack of support which we were supposed to have. Other countries, any country, even in normal countries, they are supporting area studies in big way. Unfortunately, we are not getting that much support, and that is why some of the young scholars they were so curious that this kind of book has been brought out. And I must say that this book is going to contribute in reviving a real West Asian studies discussions in our West Asia culture, which has been over dominated by much policy-centric discussions, as Professor Ramakrishnan has always been complaining about these things, that in West Asian studies we have stopped studying society, culture, politics, the key issues about the people. And in such books, I think that we are reconnecting ourselves from with West Asian studies. So congratulations once again, and looking forward to reading this book. And thank you very much. I joined this program a bit late because I got some confused with timing. So when I remembered that the timing was supposed to be 1:30 in Indian time, and I somehow I managed to join. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Umair, and taking out the time and joining the session. And I would also like to mention Mr. Anwarul Huda, who is also the governing council member of CSPS, for being part of this session and attending and being in the session for the whole time. Thank you so much, Priyanka, for this wonderful session. I think you have inspired not just me, but all the participants, and the kind of questions that we have got from the participants. It seems that we are still curious. We are still in a good position, not that bad. Also, I feel that, I just felt that this is like a Thursday seminar we are in. I can see all the familiar faces, and this is the kind of discussion we used to have in our Thursday seminars. It felt so nostalgic, so nice. Thank you so much for producing such book and giving us this opportunity to come together again to bring Professor Pasha, Professor Ramki to this platform. It's so rare right now to come back together and have this kind of discussion. I hope we will have more of a discussions on different subject on the same platform. And thank you so much, Professor Pasha, for your wonderful comments, for your insightful comments. I mean, I still feel the passion that you have while commenting, the way you used to teach us when we were doing our PhD and during our presentations as well. Thank you so much for that. It is like, we are just feeling nostalgic. The way you were giving comments, I feel, okay, he has not missed out the charm. He's still the same person. So, and thank you, Professor Ramki sir, for always being, very composed and coming back always with some bank comments. So I really feel this was one of the, very nostalgic, plus jolly, plus engaging, and very thoughtful session. Thank you so much. And I would like to thank Mr. Huda as well, who is also a governing council member of CSPS, for being part of this session as well. So thank you so much the participants as well who has been there. I mean, generally in the in the discussion, I have seen people going out, and there are only 5-6 people who is left at the end. Since this discussion was for 2 hours, and I can still see that the number of people who have joined, only few have left. So I feel like this was a completely thought-provoking and a good session. So thank you so much, everyone, for taking out time, and big congratulations to Priyanka Chandra for her book, and I wish her all the best for her future endeavor. And thank you so much, Professor Ramki, Professor Pasha, Mr. Huda, Dr. Umair, for joining this session and making it as insightful as possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Azima.
Thank you.
Bye.